the problem, Kyle, is that people are not recognizing that we're not all going to get on the same page.
Is the thought of being imperfect keeping you from taking action? Welcome to Inspired Action for Imperfect Humans. Each week, we give you real-life stories and thought-provoking research that inspires your soul to live a more fulfilled life through your own actions. From the heart of Calgary, Canada, here are your hosts, award-winning coaches, Christopher Lawrence and Kyle Kalu.
Welcome to another exciting week of Inspired Action for Imperfect Humans. Christopher, one day I'm going to get this right.
I don't think you will actually, but I feel like that is perfect because it's imperfect.
Oh, I like that. I'm going to remember you say that when I don't do something right in the business. I'm going to remember you said exactly that, and I'm going to remind you of how you loved it. Remember? You loved it that time? Okay. Well, listen.
Yeah, this time.
Welcome to part 2. This is part 2, and I had to bring this back, Christopher, because some stuff that was happening since we did part 1 on
part 2 of what,
bias.
Kyle?
Implicit. So you can't even wait for it, eh?
No, because
you even wait for it.
That's correct.
Okay, good. Thank you. This is part 2 of how does implicit bias influence your behavior, right? And so I want to get into that. Before we get into the other piece of it, let me just, for those who are listening this week and maybe you did not listen to the first part of part 1, which I know you're going to go back and look at it, let me just tell you a little bit about what implicit bias is, because I know you're hearing different things about biases and all that other stuff, but let me just, for the context of this episode, an implicit bias is an unconscious association, belief, or attitude towards any social group. Due to implicit biases, people may often attribute certain qualities or characteristics to all members of a particular group, a phenomenon known as stereotyping, right? I just want to point out, it is really important to remember that implicit biases operates almost entirely at an unconscious level, while explicit biases and prejudices are intentional and controllable. Implicit biases are less so. I want to ask you about a post you did recently, and I know we didn't get a chance to chat a little bit about it, so you may have to take a few seconds to go find that post that you recently did that I think I mentioned was interesting, and I didn't finish reading the rest of it, so I wanted to hear you talk a little bit. It's all about the whole vaccine, do you vaccine, not vaccine, and all that other stuff. Do you know the post I'm talking about?
I do, and actually I have it up here.
Okay.
But I want to be really clear about something. It wasn't about vaccines.
Okay.
That was a subject that I mentioned in it. And so I'm going to read this post because I think I got fed up. Like I seriously got fed up with kind of how our planet right now, like, seems to think we can summarize complex issues like vaccines or politics or, religion or economic systems in a few words, in a meme, or a shoddy metaphor like comparing vaccine passports to having a driver's license or an iPhone.
Interesting.
Right?
Okay.
Like, and I think it's sloppy on both sides, right? So
what you said, just to be clear, it's not just about the whole vaccine passport or vaccine. It's just in general, like things.
That's one example I gave.
Okay. Yeah,
right?
I'll be honest with you. I did not finish read the rest of it. I thought it was a lot of other
let's do
stuff
it right now.
Okay, let's hear it.
So I put in big capital letters the word shame because I wanted people to read it, and I knew that they would read it if I put that.
Okay.
So what I said was, I find it astounding that many of you on Facebook seem to believe you can summarize issues as complicated as vaccines and vaccine passports, economic systems, government policy, policing, racism, gender inequality, etc., with a few brief words, loose analogies, changing your Facebook photo frame, and poor metaphors. No matter what side you are on, it's sloppy, it's uneducated, and most of all, it's not changing anyone's mind. All it does is create factions and further implicit bias. It is possible to be embarrassed. Sorry, is it possible to be embarrassed to be a human being? Because right now, I am. I'm hurting inside. Proper discourse is a start. Discourse, I define it. Discourse is a verbal interchange of ideas, especially conversation. A formal and orderly and usually extended expression of thought on a subject. Connected speech or writing, a linguistic unit such as a conversation or story, larger than a sentence. Mm-hmm. But instead, everyone is spouting garbage. Your memes and analogies are sloppy garbage. I was shamed for celebrating Canada Day this year. But what nobody knows, I'll continue. I got to clear my throat for a second.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're writing so far, right? Because it's, I understand your viewpoint around these are complex things that we can't just boom, here's one thing on it. You know, I want you to hear the rest of it because I have a few more additional thoughts on how else can someone start the conversation.
Totally. So it's interesting because I think that my point up to this point was that people are making these statements and these loose metaphors for our political system, or you know, maybe even looking at like Donald Trump and comparing him to Hitler and 3 actions Donald Trump took that looked similar to what Hitler did, right? But it's such an understatement of the complexity of those issues. True. Mm-hmm. I never would have voted for Donald Trump, but I felt sorry for him because, like, you know, everybody's like, he's crazy. He's crazy. Well, if the man is crazy, that means he has a mental illness. And I don't treat people with a mental illness as poorly as our media and people on social media treated him.
Fair point. Yeah,
I started to feel sorry for him. Mm-hmm. Like, holy shit. A lot of people did. Yeah. Right? And it's like, and I'm not saying he was the right leader, but he was their leader.
Right.
In the United States. We have the same issue here with Justin Trudeau right now. Mm-hmm. Right? It's like, so here's how I continue. Mm-hmm. We've just defined discourse. I say, but instead of discourse, everyone is spouting garbage. Your memes and analogies are sloppy garbage. I was shamed for celebrating Canada Day this year. But what nobody knows is that I was celebrating Canada Day at Heritage Park. So in Calgary, this is it's a little park. It's got like a little heritage village in it. It's really cute. I love it. We get an annual pass every there, right? I was celebrating Canada Day at Heritage Park, and one of the first places we stopped was at the First Nations teepees. We learned about their culture, asked them how they were doing, made sure we understood what supporting them needed to look like. So to those that shamed me, what did you do? Change your Facebook cover orange? Have you actually had discourse with a First Nations person or a policeman or a POC? Have you had a conversation with a liberal or a conservative? Or if you're in the US, Republican or Democrat? Discourse, like what is defined above? Have you had discourse with a vaxxer or anti-vaxxer without trying to convince them that you are right and just listened? Have you shared in thought an idea? Or did you hide behind your Facebook post meme or short sentence summary in fear that someone else may believe differently than you?
Right.
You see that there is no one right way for everyone? It's not black and white. These issues are complex. Instead of seeing this, you choose to be right in your rightness by posting sloppy, disgusting, and uneducated comments without actually learning what the other side is saying or why they are saying it in the first place. The only attack on our freedom right now is narrow-minded, biased thinking without questioning your own biases. I don't like our world anymore. I feel lonely because I refuse to choose sides. And I feel constantly inundated with memes that make you think you're right. but you're not right. Instead, you have a perspective. Do you go out of your way to question and challenge your perspective and biases? Or do you enter all conversations with perspective of your rightness and convincing others they are wrong? Right. I will leave you with this quote from Ayn Rand. Before I leave you with the quote, this is the part that drives me nuts. I think Black Lives Matter is a really important movement, but people are lost in the messaging because what people don't understand is that if you look at social research in North America, you are more likely to be killed by a police officer if you are Caucasian, whereas if you are a person of color or Black, specifically in the research, they're more likely to get handsy with you. They're more likely to kind of push you around and get their hands on you. Right. But people don't know that when they're fighting for all this stuff. I'm not saying that the George Floyd thing was wrong. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that white people aren't the only ones that are racist. That's extremely narrow-minded. And I think that the POC and Black Lives Matter movement is getting lost in the shuffle of bad information. The work that these people are actually doing on BLM is being overshadowed by people's sloppy approach to this situation. Same thing with gender inequality. It's happening. Like it's brutal. So here's this quote. I'll leave you with this quote from Ayn Rand. As a human being, you have no choice about the fact that you need a philosophy. Your only choice is whether you define your philosophy by a conscious, rational, disciplined process of thought and scrupulously logical deliberation, or you let your subconscious accumulate a junk heap of unwarranted conclusions, false generalizations, undefined contradictions, undigested slogans. I'll also add memes, shitty metaphors, whatever. Undefined wishes, doubts, and fears, thrown together by chance, but integrated by your subconscious into a kind of mongrel philosophy and fused into a single solid weight of self-doubt, like a ball and chain in the place where your mind's wings should have grown.
Whoa. That's a lot. Great quote.
Well, girl, I'm so sick of it. Like, I'm so tired of this. It's like you know, every third post on social media is something about how, you know, someone feels their freedom is being taken away because of vaccines and vaccine passports. Go and talk to somebody who's an anti-vaxxer like I did and understand their position and recognize that some of their points are really valid. There are breakthrough viruses that are happening because, you know, with vaccinated people. Somebody posted, you know, a young guy on my Facebook on my Facebook wall posted, he's double vaxxed and he has COVID right now. So to somebody who is not vaccinated, they're trying to understand why should I go get vaccinated, right? Like they're trying to understand that, right? You know, and I'm not saying that they're right. And I know that there's, you know, people make posts it's like, if you disagree with a scientist, then you just don't understand science. This is another post that I saw this morning. And I'm like, but not all science is aligned in the same way either. Not all of the people, not all of the experts are aligned with things like COVID or politics or whatever. I think these are way more complex issues, and there won't be a single right answer.
Right. And this is a really good conversation. The reason why is, although it's heavy, I remember when I was watching a lot of movies about the AIDS epidemic and HIV, and I was just like, oh my God, another movie, right? I've seen another movie about the slave and right? And you can get someone inundated by a lot of these things over and over without kind of context. So I'm just curious, based on what you wrote, and I don't know what some of your replies have been actually, because I haven't really seen that, but based on what you wrote, if you had to bottom line it, if you had to just really simplify, you know, the main issue what you were trying to address, and if anyone who read that, or everyone who was listening to you, sometimes we do struggle with the what should I walk away with here. So what would you say the bottom line thing there in that message?
I think there's a couple of bottom line messages here. First bottom line message is is don't be sloppy about your education and other people. Don't use sloppy metaphors that do not summarize the complexity of the issues that our world is facing. You want to understand the BLM movement, you have to understand slavery. You have to understand the NAACP and the fact that they were called a terrorist organization. We call the Taliban, who right now has taken over Afghanistan, and they're saying, just leave us alone, we want to govern ourselves. That's what they're saying. I don't know what's going to happen. Right. But not all things for all people. NAACP, which is basically what got rights in South Africa for Black people and for Indian people, although Indian people came sooner because of Gandhi. But the NAACP was a terrorist organization, and they did bomb pipelines and energy and power and the rest of it. But to understand why they did that, you have to understand slavery. If you want to understand the disparaging gap between education between persons of color and white people, Caucasian people in the United States, or in Canada with First Nations people, you have to understand colonization and slavery. But people don't dig that deep. They don't dig that deep. So the core messages are, sorry, girl, can you tell I'm impassioned about this? Core messages are, don't be sloppy about your messaging. Don't be sloppy about your messaging. Second one, be kind to those that don't see the world the same way you do. Third message, check your bias. Go have a conversation. Research why the other side thinks they're right. Just from an academic perspective, not from I'm going to check off every reason why I know that their position is wrong.
Or prove to me. That's the other thing. Prove to me. Tell me when he did that. When did he do that?
That's it.
And you're not interested in the answer, is what I noticed in those conversations. Can I share with you what I got?
That's the point. They're not interested in the answer, and it's sloppy.
That's why it's sloppy.
And I think our media doesn't take responsibility for it, because that's not their goal. Their goal is ratings. They have a job just like everybody else, and social media is extremely sloppy. It's very rare to get an educated perspective on social media in a shitty meme.
Yeah. And education is one thing. It's what you do with that. You heard the expression before, knowledge is power. And I'm like, continue it, because it's not just knowledge.
It's what you do with knowledge.
Absolutely. It's what you do with that said knowledge. Here's what I got from when I heard you reading a little bit about that, and based on the bottom line that you just kind of offered about making sure you're checking your biases. The impression I get, the story I tell myself, is quite a few people are trying to speak, or the impression I'm getting, that they're trying to speak from the absolute. And that is the problem, because no one has the absolute. Right? And so when they're pointing their finger and they're saying, oh, this is what has happened, it's almost like the impression is they're speaking from an absolute, but we know we do not have the absolute. And so, lately, in the last couple of days, and I don't know about you, because I know you've been away, and prior to that, I didn't get a chance to connect with you. But a lot of my clients are talking about it, and I'm hearing a lot of absolute. Why is our government this? How come our government doesn't do this? Why is the business doing this? Why is my employer doing this? Why is my employee doing that? And it's all absolutes. And I'm like, I had one client who said, why doesn't the government show us both sides of the story? And, before making a decision, I said, in your business, do you show both sides of the story before you make a decision to your employees? Like, there's certain things that you're just not going to have all this other information. It's like,
and the point is that a decision has to be made.
Because if you do nothing, then what?
That's right. So to the people who aren't in support of the vaccine, if you were the leader of your province, your city, province, or country, what decision would you have made? Well, they might say something like, well, I wouldn't have done this. I wouldn't have, vaccine this and that. And it's like, okay. And to those that were in support of the vaccine, who are now fighting because they feel like their freedom is being taken away because you didn't want to do it, how would you respond to them? This is a lose, lose, lose situation, because no matter what position you choose, somebody's going to disagree with you. And the problem, Kyle, is that people are not recognizing that we're not all going to get on the same page. And people are fervent in their opinions. They believe this or this. And where I fall is a little bit centrist. So it's like, I'm vaccinated. I'm really, the jury's really still out on vaccine passports. I really don't think that's a good idea, personally. It's one thing going to another country. It's a totally different thing walking into a restaurant. I think
Or going to a province to another province.
as somebody who has been discriminated against for my sexual orientation over and over and over again, I'm not sure that I want to expose my medical records. I'm not sure that I want that exposed.
Yeah, and we already have a lot of those different divides. I mean, for example, if you have an STI, you don't have to tell anyone you have an STI. But if you have HIV positive, you have to. Right.
You have to.
So again, you kind of come back and say, well, which is it? And I think one thing I wanted to unpack a little bit, and I hope people who are listening and watching today at least hear the undertone of this message, is about Christopher could have a different point of view like I do, and we can still have discourse. We can still have a conversation. We can still engage. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing, coming back to that absolute. Because we see it sometimes, in other counterparts of the world, like, if you're a Republican, you can't emphasize or empathize with the Democrats. You know what I mean? And that's the same thing here. I always say to people, whoever the prime minister is in my country, that's who I support, regardless of party. If he's the prime minister, I'm going to be respectful for the prime minister. I'm not going to say Stephen. I'm going to call him Prime Minister Harper. Regardless of my view, regardless of, being a liberal person, again, he's my prime minister. And I've always showed him that due respect, right? And I think that's the piece that we find, it's an us or them mentality, which I think comes back to that whole absolute. And so what we're saying
and then we just support each other's anger and sloppiness. Like, you make one of these sloppy posts about, whatever, Justin Trudeau or Aaron O'Toole or Jagmeet Singh or Ellie Mae, like, you make a sloppy post about this stuff. And if people agree with you, it's like, and they get a dopamine response saying, yes, exactly, this is my point. And somebody else comes along and says, this isn't my point. But we're actually not listening to each other. We're just so busy making noise, talking to each other, but we're not even talking to each other. We're talking at each other. So Kyle, I have a question.
Sorry,
go ahead and make your next point, and I want to ask you a question.
I want to, so the second point that you had mentioned about being kind, and based on what you just said, the comments and the things I see, it's so mean-spirited. When they're calling someone a tool, when they're calling, what an idiot, when you, it's just all these things that we see. And, a client said to me the other day about, I'm going to the freedom rally, and I just again, my view, I said I have an issue personally with group calling that freedom, the vaccine or not being vaccine. I don't know if I associate that with freedom, so to speak, knowing our history, cultural pieces around what we've gone through when we talk about freedom to marry, freedom to vote, freedom, there's so many other things. I don't know if I would put that in the category with vaccination, but there's this thing about that whole freedom pieces. And I said, here's my thing. If you're going to call it that freedom thing, and you are the type of person who, you were there on the front line for BLM, you were there on the front line for women's rights, you were there on the front line for LGBT, then great. But a lot of these folks, I find, and what I'm seeing, is they're waving the flag about, I'm here for freedom. I'm like, where were you with transgendered rights? Where were you with, making sure people are fed? Where were you?
What about during the HIV, what about the HIV pandemic, epidemic? Yeah. Where were you with that? But this is interesting too, because the assumption, the implicit bias that people make is in the definition of freedom. Yeah. To the drug addicts across the street who are literally injecting inside them right now, that we can look down on and see and have called 911 on in our office, since we've been here, 3-4 years?
3 years, yeah, 3.5.
3 years. 3.5 years, actually. We've been in this office. We've called 911 for that situation, seeing people lying in a parking lot, literally in the center of a parking lot with people driving around them. Probably called 911 at least 6 or 7 or 8 times a year because of something going on down there. So is capitalism freedom to that person?
Interesting.
Or is socialism or communism freedom to that person? Part of the implicit bias is what freedom is. Part of the implicit bias is how you define your rights. everyone should have to have it. I am definitely a vaccine supporter, but do I think everyone should have to have a vaccine? Not necessarily.
No.
Do I think everyone needs to be properly educated? Yes, I do, so that they can make their own decision. Definitely. Right? I think that people need to know the longer that we don't have vaccines, the more people that aren't vaccinated, the more variants we are likely to have, the longer we are to be in this. I think people need to know that. Right? But this will be around forever now. Like COVID will never go away, just like the common cold or the flu. It will never, ever, ever, ever go away.
Yeah. Right. And that's the other part is we have to be mindful that because of our implicit and explicit biases is that we may not have the absolute on the information.
That's
so you
right.
have to do with what you do have access to. Right. And that's not because you're not doing anything. That's because you, like we said earlier, we heard from Christopher saying earlier, is having those engaging conversations. If you truly want to understand, go from a place of curiosity and not, well, Kyle, prove to me there's a cure. Prove to me that I cannot prove that to you, but I've made a decision with information. Have a conversation with someone who has different political views, but go from a listening perspective and a curious perspective without trying to make a point, without trying to get your point across. Let me tell you where I did this. Great story. It was with my stepdad. My stepdad has a Christian background. That's his history. I believe that he still believes in biblical things, but he has a more modern interpretation at this stage. And he and I were talking about it just a few weeks ago about when I came out of the closet. And he said, Christopher, he said, the Bible is right and your lifestyle is wrong. And this is why I do believe it's a choice. And so what I did, and I was, super anxious. Like I shook through the whole thing because he's a big guy. He's intimidating. He likes to get loud. He's a bulldozer in conversations. He's a former Calgary police officer. So he kind of holds that mentality. Like just if we're talking about a stereotype, he was a police officer, I believe in the 70s and 80s in Calgary. And so I was extremely intimidated and afraid of this conversation, but I stayed curious and I just kept asking and asking and asking questions. What it boiled down to is I finally said to him, tell me about the first time that you knew a girl was like a girl. And he told me his story. And I said, the interesting thing about that is that my story is exactly the same. Wow.
Except it was a boy and it was in this circumstance. And that's when I knew a boy was a boy.
And who can deny that experience?
And I said, so I'm really confused about your messaging. And literally, he grabbed his cup and his hands were shaking, took a sip, sat back, crossed his legs, and his hands got really big. And he says, well, you've just shattered my understanding of this. Bro, it gets me emotional.
Yeah.
And in that moment, he and I developed the most fervent respect for each other. Even though we don't see eye to eye on so many things, he and I can go and have those conversations without destroying each other. We don't have to agree. And we don't even agree to disagree. What we agree to is understanding. And we have a great relationship.
I love that. I really love that story. And I want to add a little bit to that before we kind of wrap up here. I want to add a little bit to that. And this week, we're not really going to give you any top 3 things or anything like that. I really just want to let this podcast sit with you. And the only thing I would ask is for you to reflect on some of this. And you may have to listen to it again and just slow it down and stop.
Specifically, the inspired action is to be imperfect in recognizing that your implicit bias is imperfect.
Absolutely.
And to check it, just check it.
Yeah, just kind of being aware of it. So here's a story I'm going to share with you. Just happened to me last night. So on my way home, and of course, we're always excited going home because now we're like, the day's done. We're transitioning to getting into the home side. Things are going to be a little bit easier, right? When you're at home, because you're thinking about dinner, you're thinking about either working out, you're thinking about you're going to read, you're going to watch Netflix or whatever, right? So I pulled into the garage, and then I see the phone on my car display comes up and says, this Ottawa number is calling me. And it wasn't 888 or 800 or anything. And I think to myself, because right now we get so skeptical answering the phone because there's all these auto dialers and all these things that just want to verify your number, see who answers or whatever. Some BS is going to happen. But for some reason, I picked the call. I took the call, pulled into the drive-in, didn't get out, didn't even turn off the car. And the person said, hi, I'm such and such. I am here to support. And it was for a Liberal Party, right? Because, we're going through an election. Election's coming up, and it's for a Liberal Party. And I said to myself, I just want to understand something. I said, are you in Ottawa right now, right? Because I'm in Calgary, Ottawa. That whole rivalry that happens between the West and the East and whatever, specifically Ontario. And so he goes, well, no, it's an Ottawa number, yes, but I'm not actually in Ottawa right now. I actually came out to Calgary to support the Liberal member that is running right now in the city. And I said, so let me understand this. So you're from Ottawa, using an Ottawa number, calling someone in Calgary with a 403 number, out here in the West, knowing what you know already about how we feel generally people feel about Ontario, and you're going to ask me to support a Liberal member. And he goes, he still had his high, chipper, really energized voice. Didn't even, he didn't even dip a little bit. He goes, yes, sir, that's exactly what I'm doing. And I said, thank you for doing that. And I said, after all, he goes, I think I'm a sucker for punishment. And I said, thank you for doing that. And I said, what I want you to know, thank you for doing that work. Right? So regardless of what that looks like, whoever that party is, you're still going to make that call. You're still going to see how you can drum that support. And I told him, I said, I'll support it for sure. Right? I said, from my personal viewpoint.
And you could do the same with the Conservative Party because
Absolutely.
It's kindness. You could say, this isn't, I'm not going to vote for you, but man, I have so much respect for what you do.
Absolutely. I think if I was in Ontario, knowing what I know, I'd probably do the exact same thing because I know I expect the call out here, right? And he said to me, you know what, sir? And I said, okay, you could call me Kyle, right? I said, he goes, this is probably one of the nicest conversations I've had. And so just thank you for that. And I'm glad he said that because he's recognized it, because I know it's not an easy gig, right? It's almost like people in sales. It's not an easy gig when you're out there knocking on doors and cold calling. It's not an easy gig. And, I think we did a podcast on rejection, and then if we didn't, we were going to do one, right? Because it's not an easy thing. And the fact that he did all that and still, right? That takes something. That takes someone who's mindful that, hey, I may get some rubs based on what you just said about checking the bias. He may have an implicit bias of, I know people are not going to be so overwhelming. I know people are going to, hung up the phone on me. I know people are going to probably say one or two flavor things. He didn't mention any of those things to me, but he just said, this is one of the nicest conversation. And he's like, I wish you a great evening. And I said, thank you. Right? So I think it's possible. What we've been talking about is about being mindful and checking that in. You could still, like Christopher just said, you could still have a conversation with someone who says, I appreciate the call, not my party, but I appreciate the call, or I don't like the platform, whatever that is for you. And you can still be a kind person. So we want to leave you with that today. We want to let you know we are really all about community. One thing that we've just launched is our Facebook group on the same title of our podcast, so Inspired Action for Imperfect Humans. This is not just about us. We want to build a community where we could have these conversations, where people could also help other people, where people can have a place that they can go and have a conversation without feeling that they're judged and all this other stuff. So if you're on Facebook and you're interested in this group, please search for it, request to be joined to the group. We will see you in that community. Until next week, take care.
It's our goal to build a global community of inspired action takers, and we can only do that with your help. So if you love Inspired Action, please leave a review on your favorite podcasting app and share us on your socials. You've heard from us. Now we want to hear from you. Go to inspiredactionpodcast.ca and tell us, what is the inspired action you took this week? Next week on Inspired Action for Imperfect Humans.
Tara looked at him and said, John, I'm not your slave and I'm not your lackey. I did my job, and maybe you needed to be here on time so that you could help troubleshoot some of these issues. And if you have a problem with it, why don't you deal with IT? I am done working for you in this moment. I'm going to leave the room. Good luck.